Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Catherine Nauman, and I am your host of The Environment is in Our Hands, a Call to Action podcast, where we interview experts, educators, and advocates on a wide range of environmental issues with the goal of making these valuable conversations accessible to a broader audience. By the end of each episode, I hope we all leave feeling more knowledgeable, empowered, and confident to take practical action towards creating meaningful change. Today is part one of a two-part interview with the Dara Gellman. I hope you enjoy. Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Environment is in Our Hands, a Call to Action podcast. Today we have our guest, Dara Gellman. Thank you so much for joining us, Dara.
My pleasure.
She is the program leader of the My Clothes, My World program at Fashion Takes Action, also known as FTA, which is Canada's leading non-for-profit advancing sustainable fashion through education, tools, events, and advocacy. Dara has been in the field of education for over 20 years now, working as a teacher before joining FTA, where she now develops incredible resources for teachers as a means of incorporating sustainable education into school curriculum. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us today, Dara.
Thank you.
We are really looking forward to learning about the work that you do for FTA, sustainable fashion, and discussing the actions that we can all take to take meaningful action as well towards that. So I wanted to start off by opening the space for you to tell us just a bit about what first sparked your interest in fashion, and if there was a moment that you can remember where the environmental and social impacts of the industry really became apparent to you.
Well, thank you so much for asking me that question. I love thinking back on that concept of where I first became interested. And I think the first thing that I think of is when I was a kid, I was in a summer camp and they had bags of offcuts from some kind of clothing process. I don't know what. And I was able to make clothing by like just tying and, connecting things together. And I did like a fashion show, and that kind of tracked through like into high school. Actually, somebody in home economics, which isn't taught as much now, might be more known as family studies, showed me how to use a pattern to sew clothing. So I actually really got into sewing my own clothing and costumes. And my first job was at an independent fashion designer in Toronto as part of the Fashion Incubator program. And so I had a sort of very early inside look at how clothing is actually made, and also kind of at that smaller scale, but still with kind of manufacturing or industrial kind of processes. Like I learned to sew on an industrial sewing machine. So I was always interested in fashion. Like I love fashion, I love clothing, I love it as a means of self-expression. I'm also an artist, so to me, these things are like very connected. And to be honest, for a long time in my life, I was not aware of the impacts of fashion at all. Certainly as a young person, I had absolutely no idea. I'd never heard anything about it. I think as I got older and became a consumer, properly, like totally independent as an adult, and I started to think more about like what I wanted to buy, how much money I had. I started to notice labels. But also, I think really I became aware of sustainable fashion because of my interest in sustainability in general in my life. So I'm a plant-based eater for reasons related to sustainability. Other things in my life I really try to do in a sustainable way. Of course, I'm just learning and growing like everybody. But that is what brought me to the concept of sustainable fashion before I got involved with FTA. So it kind of laterally came across that way.
That's so cool. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And how would you say that journey ultimately led you to FTA?
Yeah, that's a great follow-on question. So I was a classroom teacher for many years in the visual arts and interdisciplinary studies, and I always brought sustainability into the projects where I could. I'm also an artist, and I was talking to you before the podcast about also working in food. So there's all these sort of creative elements in the background, my prior interest in fashion. So I decided to leave classroom teaching as a kind of daily practice a few years ago after sort of the main part of the COVID era had finished. And a colleague of mine actually in the sustainability space said, "Oh, I heard about this position. You've got to apply."
Wow.
I'm not sure I would have ever seen it actually. So props to my friend. She knows who she is. And I did. And it just seemed like the perfect blend, of all of these interests. I don't think you have to be especially interested in fashion per se to work in this space, because it is really about sustainability.
Absolutely.
But it certainly, I think, helps to have an insider sense of like how clothing is made, because a lot of the impacts have to do with that process.
Right. Yeah.
So when you know them, you can, I think, empathize more with the bits that aren't just about the consumption end or the waste end.
For sure. Yeah. And do you mind telling us a bit about your work at FTA? I know that you're implementing a lot of sustainable fashion curriculum and helping teachers with those lesson plans, which is incredible. So I'm curious to hear about that transition, and yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to tell you about that. I mean, I think the thing that I bring to being the program leader of the educational program is that I know what it's like to be a teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And when I started FTA, we really wanted to sort of establish what it is that we feel we can do for education. Now, of course, FTA already had an established education program, but it was after COVID when I came into FTA. So it was like a need to sort of revamp and rethink the approach, because COVID changed a lot for educators in terms of what their daily life was like, and also after COVID restrictions lifted, like what it was like to be in a classroom, because things really did change. So I think we really understand, because we have done a lot of education work, and also I'm a prior educator, or still am, but just not in that same way, that educators have a lot of stresses and pressures.
For sure.
They want to teach sustainability. So the data, like UNESCO data, shows that like 90%, probably more than that, of teachers care about climate and sustainability. But like 30% just don't have the resources or support. Because let's say you're a math teacher, you care about sustainability. Do you then go out and teach yourself that on your own time? Teachers have so many pressures around care of their students, not just what they're teaching. So to ask a teacher to become a subject matter expert, if they're not already, is a really big lift. So that informs all of our work, that we want to make sure that teachers are prepared and don't have to do like another side project to get ready. So we teach workshops. So that's one of the reasons we can go into a classroom and teach a workshop with a classroom teacher present, but really kind of guiding their students through a learning process. But also we create lesson plans or unit plans where the teacher does not have to prepare. So it's not like an outline. It literally tells you everything you need to do, background knowledge. And of course, teachers are smart. They know how to pick and choose like what they want. But the idea is maybe you don't know exactly how to approach this subject. So there's ideas about interdisciplinary connections.
For sure.
What's really great is we've got some funding to sort of transform our unit plans, which were traditionally like a digital download, into an online learning environment. So coming in the next school year, probably in the new year, so like 2027, early on, we're going to be creating an online, or launching an online learning environment where teachers can access a course or a unit that has a couple of, let's say, 1 hour lessons in it. And the material is like step by step for the teacher to deliver in the classroom. So it's really geared at making this accessible and doable for teachers. There'll be like cool interactive elements, which you know something about, for students, and other things as well that teachers can use. And that way, hopefully, you don't just have to be in Toronto where you can take a workshop. You could be anywhere in Canada, much more, hopefully, accessible way for people in all sorts of different communities to access this kind of learning. And at the end of the day, yes, it's related to fashion, but fashion is the entry point, so that we can talk about climate and sustainability. It's not really sort of looking at fashion for the sake of fashion design, for example. And sometimes people might think that it's about like how to design sustainable clothing. And some content might touch on what some of those elements are, but it's really about using it as an entry point for young people who fashion can matter so much.
Absolutely.
And I think it's worth saying, if you don't mind me tacking on, that fashion does not mean like fancy clothes. I think that we often associate that word with like the runway or, something like that. But really fashion, another word for fashion is just clothing. And that can incorporate school uniforms. It can encompass like your underwear and socks, your workout clothing, your fancy stuff, your jeans, your weekend wear, your sweatpants. So, that's what we mean when we say fashion. And we like to often in our materials just kind of make that side note so that people don't feel like, well, I don't wear fancy clothes or I don't buy expensive clothes, which of course we all buy what we can access. Sometimes we don't even buy the clothes, we get given them or what have you, but it doesn't have to be fashion with a capital F.
Yeah, I love that point because I think, a lot of times, like you said, with the word fashion, we can immediately think designer clothes or, just really having a fascination for, for different pieces of clothing in a particular way. But what's so true is that we all play a role in fashion. And so it's really not something that's just applicable to some people. We all purchase clothing and wear it on a daily basis. And so, yeah, it really is something that encompasses everyone.
Yeah, I think that's so well said. It's not about trends or, I mean, of course, that's part of it, but everybody wears clothing. That's basically what it comes down to. And that's why it's such a relatable entry point for people, but also for youth. Because it is something that you're starting to learn, what you want to pick, what your style is. And as you get older, you start to have some agency, depending on your context, but where those clothes might come from. You may not have any agency about that. You may not have choice, but you can still think about what happens to the clothes. And so I think it's also important to note that we are understanding that students and teachers come from like a really wide variety of socioeconomic contexts. So we're not offering one path to be a sustainable kind of fashion consumer or citizen, because we really are coming at it from different ways, and we have to recognize that everybody has different access and capabilities around their choice. But that I think there are enough strategies within that everybody can find something that they can do around, especially disposal of clothing.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, you guys focusing so much on the education piece is huge because, like you said, fashion being an entry point for climate action, the first step is always knowing and recognizing the issue that is there, and then tailoring those steps to what we each have the resources to do and the opportunities. So thank you so much for that. All right, so before we dive into overconsumption and the fashion industry more broadly, Dara, I wanted to ask you a simple question, but also with a pretty complex one, which is, why would you say we buy clothes?
So that's a great question. And some of the best questions are simple and complex. I think, okay, why do I buy clothes? I think that's the way I want to answer the question, if that's okay. Because I think that what the whole issue of sustainable fashion is really about individualizing your understanding and then what your actions, what you're going to do. So why do I buy clothes? I think, and people will maybe share some of these thoughts or feelings. I think I buy clothes to express myself. I find clothing to be, or can be, creative. Not my sweatpants, but I feel like I love the tactility of clothing. So like the fabrics, the materials. I know how clothing is made, so I appreciate garments as a construction. I wouldn't say that they're artworks, but like, adjacent to kind of craft. So those are some of the sort of more, conceptual ideas. But also I buy clothing, to feel like I fit in, I'm warm, I'm dressed appropriately for an event, I'm comfortable. I think there's all sorts of reasons about identity that are, that people will perceive me a certain way, or in a style or a vibe, or, whatever it is. So I think the other day I was wearing something and I thought, I feel like myself. And that is a very intangible thing to put your finger on. But I think we all know what it's like when you're wearing something where you don't feel comfortable or it's not quite right. And then there are the times where you're like, yeah, that's me. And that's really hard to nail down. But I think that's a big part of clothing consumption.
Absolutely. In one of our sustainable fashion council meetings, I remember we were talking about the differences between wants and needs. And I was just curious if you want to kind of give us a rundown of what that looks like in terms of fashion. And then I kind of have a list of 6 different things that I'm curious to hear what you would deem them as wants or needs.
Well, this is an area that we're working on a curriculum about, and I think it's really sort of both simple and complex.
Yeah.
So I think wants and needs are deeply intertwined in fashion in a way that maybe they aren't quite so much in other things. Like,
Yeah.
I know I need food, but do I need, a $10 piece of cheese as opposed to something else or whatever it is? Like, I can more clearly understand there that I have like a basic bodily need around food versus my want for something tasty or, organic or, junky or whatever it is. I think with fashion, where that comes into play is in the marketing, and this really connects to consumption and overconsumption, is that the needs and wants are intertwined in a way that it's very hard to sort out, even if you know what those are.
Right.
So I might be like, I need a jacket, but I'm not just going to go and get any jacket. And I probably care if I'm thrifting what the jacket looks like. I'm not just sort of closing my eyes and picking something. So I think that's when we start to have that sort of interaction between, I need something to, let's say, be warm, but what is the want attached to it that might further just delineate my decisions? And I think marketing, especially with micro seasons now, so like we're looking at every week is a new fashion season with fast fashion brands. And fast fashion, of course, is not the only kind of part of fashion that has responsibility around sustainability. All fashion has to be kind of looked at in that light, all clothing production. That's when we get confused, I think. I get confused. It's like, do I actually need this pair of black pants? Or do I want it for reasons that have been sort of prompted in me around belonging, style, expression, feeling left out, just feeling that need to want to buy something.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, with that being said, we'll go through a list of 6 different things, and just feel free to say if you think it's a want or need, and maybe giving us a rough idea.
I'm going to get some of these wrong for sure.
You're good. So the first one is to be safe and protected.
I think that is a need.
And
I think, I think it's a need.
Yeah, okay. I think so as well. The second one is buying a hoodie because you like the color.
So I think that's probably a want, but there may be a need underneath it, like I need something for warmth or comfort. But I think the aesthetics of it transcend need and go into want, I'm guessing.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think context, like we were talking about earlier, is so huge. Because, if someone has 20 hoodies and they're like, oh, I want this 21st one for the color, that is certainly a want.
Yeah.
And so, this whole idea of just adding to your wardrobe for a color or style, it can be disguised as a need because we do want that acceptance and sense of belonging. But truly, at the end of the day, it is a want because we can fulfill that in other ways. And we're kind of looking to fulfill it through purchasing and, shopping. So
it is nuanced. I mean, I think also I can think of a context where, like, let's say all of your friends wear hoodies and you don't own one. Like, I don't love hoodies. Like, I like sweat, but zip up sweatshirts, but I don't like the hood. But like, let's say for a younger person, they feel like they don't feel like they belong or will be accepted in a certain context because they're not sort of signaling a certain style. Then I think it is tricky. And I think the idea here is also is that there's no sense of like, there's a blame or shame around confusing needs or wants. I think that's the human experience. And I think what we're trying to do when we talk about these things is unravel how these things can be used kind of against our best interests, because spending more money than we might have available for clothing is not in most people's best interest. And I think young people are especially targeted to really overconsume and spend money that they may not have a lot of, but also overconsumption in general of anything, including fashion, is not in human beings' best interest.
Yeah.
So when we try and unravel these things, we're not looking to get to some kind of point of perfection where, oh, you did it great, but oh, you didn't do it so great. There is no perfect, sustainable consumer. I think it's really about like, oh, reflecting on what do I do without that blame or shame. And then saying, well, if I bought 20 things last month, maybe I understand that could be a lot for me or in general. And maybe, I'm going to start thrifting, or I'm going to change my concept of what I really actually need by looking what I already own. So it's all relative to the person. And I think I really want people to understand that this is not about getting to some kind of vision of perfection.
Absolutely. Yeah. I love that element of self-reflection, and everyone's path looking different, but the end goal being the same, which is that we want to move into a more sustainable way of consuming fashion, and expressing ourselves, which is, like you said, absolutely possible. But there is not one definitive objective way to do this. And so it really falls, I think it falls on each of us as an individual, and then also collectively to come together, and kind of brainstorm and think of new ways that we can do this. And just really implement that in the industry and in the system. The next one we have is shopping online because you're bored. Is that a want or a need?
I think a lot of people feel that it's a need, but I would feel it's definitely a want. Absolutely. And I think that some of the material that we're looking at, and we're working with somebody who's an expert in psychology behind consumption, is that this is actually deeply targeted and manipulated in people. There's certain times of day when you're tired and bored, especially like at night. So your defenses are down. And I personally know that that's a time where if I've had my eye on something, even as a just browsing, like I think probably a lot of people can relate to purchasing things in those times. I don't like stop in my workday when I'm super busy and engaged and go, oh, I'm going to scroll and buy something. That's never happened, So I think that is a mechanic that is deeply manipulated to take advantage of that time. And most of us are going to be online potentially on devices when we're tired and bored. So the perfect, kind of, you're already primed, right? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. I think, and we'll get more into impulse buying and social media's influence on that, in really manipulating our wants and needs and kind of confusing them with one another. But yeah, I think it's a great point that there's certain times of the day and there's certain moments that that our defenses are down. And, if we're not aware of that, and we're not putting into practice this mindful consuming or consumption, that will get the best of us. And we're also going to learn about the environmental implications of that. Which are not so fun.
But necessary. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think in a way you can think about it being empowering because, part of what is happening in the fashion industry, like every other industry, is that the impacts are being purposefully kind of obscured, let's say, from the consumer. And at the end of the day, it's about buying and doing something that a company needs, which is to support their work, to make money, all of these things. And so part of that empowerment is like, okay, that's the context that we purchase things in and we behave in. But the bigger context of being a citizen is also like looking back at yourself. It's like, what do I want for myself?
Absolutely.
Beyond just attaining the items, for example, so I think the point is that we are not going to get stuck in the doom and gloom. We're going to go beyond that. And I think that is something that a lot of people struggle with, and myself included, rightfully so, is that you learn the impacts and then you're just like, ugh. So it's really important in our educational work also when we work with younger people, because they do really suffer from climate anxiety, as I think we all do, but in much greater proportions. Because younger people are more aware and awake and savvy to what's happening in this world, I would say, as a general characterization, that you really need to make sure you don't leave it in the negative, so that there's an action that can be taken. And that's so empowering.
Yeah, for sure. They're being a fact, but not ending at that. They're actually being an action, meaningful action you can take out of it. Otherwise, there's nothing you can do except for really sit in that, and I think feel all of those, hopelessness kind of feelings. But like you said, when we have a tangible action there, we can really move forward in such an incredible way. And so thank you.
Thank you. I just want to say that this podcast in and of itself is an action. It's really impressive that you put this on, but important that when we learn information, we can kind of like think about it, process it, and share it with others. And that's grassroots community change. That's how citizens, I think, in all sorts of other scenarios, have acted and shown us that that's how change can happen, is when we share our interests, our curiosities, our questions, our inspirations, and our values, our ideas with other people. And then they go, oh, I had no idea. And I found that a lot in my work with FTA, like even in my life, talking to people more and more about what I've learned in my own job, about how I teach people and what I have learned about what needs to be taught. Talking to people about that process, they've said, oh, well, I was going to buy that thing, but I waited, or I thought about where it came from, or I made an effort to resell my old clothes and then, or thrift, or whatever it is. There's so many strategies. And it's not to sort of say like, oh, it's because of me. It's just more that each person is part of a network, of communications. And we don't necessarily always realize that we can impact people subtly, and that it can actually get inside of their thinking as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then make these domino effects
That's
down
right.
the line.
Yeah.
And quite astounding. All right, we have 2 left here, which is wearing a different stylish outfit for every Instagram post.
Probably a want, but sometimes feels like a need, but definitely a want. And I think that's another thing that especially young people have been kind of targeted to feel like clothing is disposable in the sense of like a paper plate. That was not true even a couple of decades ago. So it's really, to use the word astounding, like astounding and wild that we've gotten to a point where we're so disconnected from the reality of what it takes to make clothing. And I just mean we as the world, that clothing can be seen as something, as a click and a one-time thing. And it's kind of wild when you see like, some star wore their dress a second time and that like makes the news. It's like, even a few decades ago, maybe you had one dress for an occasion, so things have really changed in a way that current generations are not aware of that history, because it changed just before maybe their consumer, leading up to their consumer kind of capabilities. But it's really a radical change in how we deal with clothing.
Absolutely.
In a very short period of time, relatively speaking.
Yeah. That actually brings me to the fact that you shared with us in our Sustainable Fashion Council meeting, which was that how much we consume today compared to 20 years ago is about 60% more, and that we own the clothes for half as long. So I guess touching on that, what would you say are some of the biggest things causing this today? Feel free to touch on fast fashion and the micro seasons that you were mentioning earlier. Before,
I think that's a great thing to put it in context. Is that, I think for most of human history where we wore, clothes, even if they were made out of, skins and things like that, we did not have a lot of clothing. Clothing was precious, the material that was used to make clothing. So even like furs, skins, like, weaving, all of these kinds of things had to be made by human hands. Most clothing is still actually passed through human hands. People think that it's all just made, push a button by a machine, but that's not actually true. So, although of course there is some, processes that do that. So, here's an example. I live in a house that is over 100 years old. So it's like Victorian era. The closets are about this wide. Why are they that small? And a lot of people, let's say in Toronto where I live, have these older homes that everyone complains about these tiny little closets. Why? Because people did not own a lot of clothing. You might have the thing you wore to work, the thing you wore on a Sunday or whatever, and maybe something that was for some kind of special cultural event. And so in the last 20 years, we've gone from seasonal clothing, so following the actual seasons, spring, summer, fall, winter. Somehow I almost couldn't remember that. And, I would say that following the seasons means that your clothing purchases would be more likely to be made out of some actual needs. So winter clothing versus lighter clothing. Of course, style and fashion plays a role, but there weren't the same opportunities. Imagine, if you can, a pre-internet age where you could not buy online. that meant you physically had to go to a store, try it on, select it, line up at the cash, pay for it, or order from a catalog, which meant you would have had to mail or phone it in. So there was a lot of what they call friction in buying. It wasn't like that.
Right.
So that friction, the friction provides like a pause, I think, time to think about your purchase. You would have probably thought about it longer because you, wouldn't have been used to buying as much. So purchases would have meant more, would have been less common for a lot of people. And so now we've gone from 4 seasons to micro seasons, which are every week. So some manufacturers or brands are putting out a season of clothing every single week. And we do know now that some online retailers are putting out as many as 10,000 new styles a day.
Wow.
So you could order that style and then the next day there's all of these other styles. So the rate has increased exponentially. So we just buy, I think I did the math, like 60% more clothing, but we keep it for half as long, means that essentially we're almost buying like triple the volume.
Wow.
So that has become the norm. We've got this issue of like disposable clothing essentially. And if you buy some clothing from some online retailers, like if you buy a shirt for $5.99, if you stop and think for a moment, now the problem is that most of us don't know how clothing is made, like the conditions under which it's made, but the literal process. But if you think about how can somebody grow cotton or extract oil, then either weave cotton or whatever it is, or make polyester, then design a pattern, cut it, sew it, package it, ship it, display, how can that be achieved for $5 or $10 or $15 or even $20? It can't be achieved without somebody really getting the short end. And that person is the factory worker and everybody before the retailer, the cotton grower, what have you. The people who are also getting affected are all of us because there are environmental impacts from those processes. So I think we've just gotten used to this. It seems normal. There is a phenomenon in climate change called shifting baseline syndrome, which is, for example, in terms of climate, you kind of accept what's happening now as the norm that you've grown up with, and you don't go, oh, my parents said it was 10 degrees, whatever, the difference. And I think that's true with fashion. I'm just sort of extrapolating that, but when we see, oh, everybody just does this now, we don't go, oh, what happened before? Why is this changed? Except we can do that. And that sort of analysis can help us think about whether the increased rate of consumption is actually good for us right now. And not in terms of what we look like or what we're wearing, but in terms of all of the other impacts. I wish that there was, I'm a big Star Trek fan. I wish there was like a replicator where you could just, molecularly create clothing. You're finished with it. It gets recycled. Unfortunately, it's far from the truth that there are serious impacts to people and planet. And so this super cheap buying is not in our favor as a species. But also I will say that it's not just fast fashion is not the only area that we need to look at. That just because it costs more or comes from a non-fast fashion brand does not mean that it's not impactful. And I will also say that, some fast fashion garments can be well made and can last for 10 years. So it's all about how you're consuming. It's not just, we're going to demonize this brand and say this one's okay. We're going to think about how we do these things. We can talk more about that. And also that we can, if we have the economic capacity, make choices about brands that are working towards sustainability as well. So there's like all of this mix and matching that we could do.
Yeah. I love that term, shifting the baseline. I'd never heard that before, but it makes so much sense. And I think just thinking about how now we can, within a click, get something coming in tomorrow. And that was actually going to be the next thing on the list of buying the latest clothing online and it, arriving the next day if that's a want or need. And so, my mind is in so many places, but I think with what you were saying with the environmental impacts and also the labor and human rights difficulties that just arise whenever we're purchasing clothing that is cheap. We know that someone down the line is getting really, really impacted by that purchase. And the term externalities always comes to mind, especially in fashion and just super inexpensive clothing too. I think you touched on it perfectly by saying that we're all being impacted by these purchases because they are contributing to a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, water contamination. The list goes on, and Dara will touch on that. But yeah, so I think how you said no t-shirt truly is $6, $10, even $20, really goes to show that what we are not paying for when we are at the cashier is being paid for by the planet, and how many trees are going down, how much emissions are being emitted. So yeah,
I think that's so true. And I think, you touched on one thing that I could have sort of emphasized but didn't, which is social media. I think that's one of the key driving factors of consumption. And I think it sort of blinded us to these consequences that you're talking about, because there are way more people interested in the sort of style and consumption aspects of fashion that get the traction. I mean, of course, there are a lot of sustainability advocates, but of course, it's not as sellable, right?
No,
sustainability doesn't sell, so it doesn't get the same kind of attention in some ways, although in others it does. And I think that norm, the instant buying, has really clouded our vision to what happens that we can't see. And that's the problem with fashion, is that, my shirt, which I actually made myself,
that's incredible,
but it doesn't emit the greenhouse gases that came from growing the linen or shipping it to the, whereas my car or something like that, like I get it's not abstract. If I'm thinking about my car or a plane, I get greenhouse gases, carbon, that kind of stuff. Clothing doesn't show the impact, and the impacts are often hidden either from our, Canadian context communities, or it's outside of cities. And then also we'll get into this, I think, a little bit, that a lot of these externalities or sort of consequences, sometimes unintended, other times the consequences are known, are pushed into other countries and other regions. So it's even further afield from our daily life. But certainly in, a major city in Canada, I am not aware in my daily life, and most people are not, of what happens to textile waste, for example. And that is the flip side of the consumption, is what happens to it when you're done with it. And if it's $5.99, you will not own that t-shirt in a year or 10 years. It's going to have to go somewhere probably quite quickly. And that's something that we'll touch on. I think it's one of the things that we don't see, but we need to know about.
Yeah, for sure. I think just going off of that, are there any huge facts that you've learned recently, or just over the past couple of years, regarding the fashion industry's impact on the environment that that you would like to share with us?
Yeah, I think there's 3 or 4 numbers that are really key, and I think paint that picture. And you can kind of imagine, like, I think the 2 main things, if I wanted people to take away, are to think about the level of consumption that they engage in. And again, it's all relative. So for one person, it might be like, they acquire either thrifting or new 10 things, and another person is 200 things. We can all still take a look at what we're doing. And then it's about what we get and then what we do with it. So in terms of production, so how much is made, I often get students to guess, well, how many items do you think are made every year? And they'll say like 10 million, or okay, there's 8 billion people in the world, so like 16 billion or something like that.
Oh boy.
So the number is, the estimate, I should say, is 100 to 150 billion, with a B, garments are made every year. So I say to students, like, okay, in 5 years at 100 billion, that's 500 billion garments a year. Now, why is it an estimate? I think it's worth noting. It's an estimate because manufacturers generally do not tell the public clearly how many items they make. And I think that has to do with like the chain of responsibility that would fall after sort of exposing, oh, I made 10,000 hot pink t-shirts. Well, what happened to them?
Right.
And we'll get to that in a second. So the numbers are very obscured, and there's been some great activism around that. So people doing campaigns to get manufacturers to reveal the volume of production. But our best estimate based on some data is 100 to 150 billion a year.
Wow.
So if you start to think about that racking up, I mean, it's kind of insane.
Yeah.
Not just because of the physical mass of where that all goes in our homes, our lives, our landfills, but the resources that would be required. Yeah. And given that there are, I don't know what the current world population is. I think it's 8 billion. I mean, that's a lot of items per person every year.
I'm going to have to abruptly stop us right here. Please tune in to the second part of the interview, which should be linked in the show notes. I hope you enjoy.